hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow any light that touched them. The figure stood motionless, staring directly into the camera. And I felt it. That terrible, suffocating feeling of being watched, being observed by something that was not human, something that had no place in this world. It was me, but it wasn't. The camera zoomed in on the figure's face, and I recoiled in horror. Its mouth opened, a smile, a grin that was wide, far too wide, stretching impossibly across the face. It was like looking at a reflection of myself, distorted, twisted, wrong. The smile stretched unnaturally, like it was pulling the skin at the corners of its mouth. And then, in a voice that was far too familiar, a voice that sounded like my own but was laced with something darker, it whispered, "You can't run from what you've become." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing, panic flooding through my veins. I could hear my breath ragged and uneven as if I had just sprinted a marathon. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing, trying to understand what I had just seen. That wasn't me. That couldn't be me. But deep down I knew. I knew it was. The whispers were louder now, pounding in my head like a relentless drumbeat. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices calling out to me, pulling me in. It was like a magnet dragging me toward the abyss. I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the file anymore. It wasn't just some digital nightmare. It had become a part of me, a part of my soul, something that I couldn't exorcise, something that had crawled inside me, taking root. I tried to leave. I tried to run, to escape the apartment. But the moment I stepped out the door, I froze. The hallway was dark, silent, and yet I felt it. That presence, that thing that had been following me, watching me. I could feel it, closing in. It was waiting for me, just beyond the threshold, just beyond the edge of my perception. I turned around and stumbled back into the apartment, shutting the door behind me with trembling hands. But I could feel it now, stronger than ever. That thing that wasn't a thing, the part of me that was missing, that had been consumed, taken by the darkness. I could hear it now in the quiet of my apartment, in the stillness of the night. "You can't escape. You are mine now." And I knew with sickening clarity that the worst was still ahead. The file hadn't just haunted me. It had marked me, bound me to something far darker than I could comprehend. And as I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized one horrifying truth. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me, suffocating me in the quiet, oppressive darkness. My breath was shallow, ragged, and the sound of my heartbeat thudded painfully in my chest. I could still hear the voice, my own, twisted and distorted, repeating that one sentence over and over. "You are mine now." It echoed in my mind, louder than the pounding in my ears, filling the empty space in the room until I couldn't think of anything else. There was no escape, no way out. I tried to move, but my body felt like lead, heavy and unwilling to cooperate. It was as if the very air around me had thickened. Each step I took a struggle against an invisible force holding me down. I stumbled, back to the desk, unable to tear my eyes away from the laptop. The screen was dark now, lifeless, but I knew deep down that it was far from over. The file, the voices, the images, they weren't just going to let me go. They had already become a part of me. My hands trembled as I reached for the laptop again. What was I hoping to find? A way to reverse it? A way to undo the damage I had done by opening the file in the first place? But even as I turned it on, I already knew the truth. There was no undoing this. I was already lost. The laptop powered on with its usual slowness, the fan whirring as it came to life. I stared at the screen, the darkened desktop glaring back at me. And then, with sickening inevitability, the crimson icon appeared once more. Last file 01 dat. The same file, the same terror. But this time, something was different. The file didn't just sit there waiting for me to click it. No, this time it was pulsing, a slow, rhythmic throb like a heartbeat, the crimson glow intensifying with every pulse. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, frozen in place. I didn't want to open it again. I couldn't. But the compulsion was overwhelming. I could feel it pulling me in, like a gravitational force that I had no power to resist. I clicked. The file opened with a swift, mechanical motion. But this time there were no cryptic words, no eerie messages. Instead, the screen filled with a vast, endless darkness. A void, consuming everything in its path. I could feel it, this deep, suffocating emptiness seeping through the screen, creeping into my mind. It wasn't just a visual representation of darkness. It was the very sensation of being swallowed whole. You're here. The words appeared, jagged and broken, as though they were being dragged out of the screen, each letter appearing in uneven intervals. I recoiled as if the words themselves were physically painful. The darkness on the screen shifted and something began to form within it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I realized, no, it was a face. Not my face this time. Not the twisted version from the alleyway, but something else. A face with hollow eyes, a mouth that stretched too wide, its lips curling upward into a grotesque grin. The features were distorted, inhuman, but there was something unnervingly familiar about it. It was as though this face was mine, but warped, twisted beyond recognition. I couldn't look away. The face on the screen leaned closer, its expression filled with malice, as if it were somehow alive, somehow aware of me. And then it spoke, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other, all of them vying for my attention. It said my name, it whispered my name, and the sound was unbearable. You should have never opened the file. Tiantiu, words were like ice, freezing my very soul, freezing my mind. The weight of the voice pressed down on me, a crushing weight that seemed to stop my breathing entirely. I tried to close the laptop, to shut out the face, to end this nightmare. But my hands wouldn't move. They were glued to the desk, locked in place by some invisible force. The face grinned wider, and with each passing second, it seemed to grow more monstrous, its eyes widening in a way that wasn't physically possible, until the pupils were nothing but black holes sucking in all the light around them. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt the distinct sensation of something cold and sharp pressing against my skin, as if the very air around me was turning hostile. You're not in control anymore. It's too late for that. The voice twisted, the words elongating them as though savoring each syllable. I felt something stir inside me, a gnawing sense of dread, like the voice was taking hold of my very thoughts, planting seeds of terror in the deepest recesses of my mind. You can't escape, it whispered again, but this time I could hear something else. A scraping sound, distant at first but growing louder. It sounded like nails against glass, scraping, screeching, tearing at my sanity. The screen began to crack, tiny fractures, spreading out across its surface. But the cracking wasn't just visual. I could feel it in my own mind, as if the cracks in the screen were reflected in the cracks within me. The darkness on the screen shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just a face. The shadows seemed to move, flowing like liquid, coiling around, the edges of the screen reaching out toward me. And then, I saw something. A figure, or perhaps a presence, standing just beyond the edge of the screen. It wasn't human, but it was undeniably real. It was there, watching me. Its dark, empty gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was waiting. The presence didn't move, but I could feel it. Feel its hunger, its desire. It wasn't just watching. It was feeding off my fear, off the terror that was beginning to choke me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in this digital nightmare, unable to tear myself away from the screen. Come to me, the voice hissed, and the figure on the screen seemed to step forward, the shadows wrapping around it like a cloak. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, pulling itself free from the confines of the screen, inching closer to me, inch by inch. I could feel the presence reaching out, its fingers brushing against my skin, cold as ice. "You're already here. You've always been here." The words didn't just reverberate in my ears. They rippled through my very soul, bending reality itself, twisting the world around me until I couldn't tell the sun would set on a world no one would ever return to. The air, once so familiar and filled with the rhythm of life, began to feel heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down on the shoulders of humanity. At first, it wasn't noticeable, just small things. A person walking down the street turned a corner and never came back. A phone call went unanswered. The hum of cars on the highway slowly died down, as though the machines themselves had grown weary of existence. There were no alarms, no catastrophic events to signal the end. The day passed like any other, but there was an eerie, creeping sense of something terrible coming, something unavoidable. In the evening, the first signs appeared. People who had been walking in the park stopped mid-step, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion or fear, but no one was there to see it. The sky seemed to darken for a moment, not from storm clouds, but from something deeper, as though the heavens themselves had grown tired of watching humanity scurry about. And then, like the ticking of a clock that had been wound too tightly, the unthinkable happened. Everyone disappeared. It wasn't an explosion or a flash of light. There were no warnings or final screams. It was just the absence of life, the silence that fell in place of bustling crowds, of voices, of the mundane noise of a world that had been filled with people for as long as anyone could remember. In the space of a single heartbeat, the earth went from a living, breathing entity to a hollow, abandoned shell, and yet, as the clock continued to tick, the air was still thick with the remnants of humanity. A faint trace of warmth left behind, as though the very essence of those who had vanished lingered, hesitant to let go of their former existence. It was the last day anyone would ever know the comfort of human connection, the last day the world would pulse with the heartbeat of the many. No one knew where they had gone or why, and no explanation was ever found. All that remained was the world, now strangely empty, yet still haunted by the memory of those who once filled it. The cities stood as towering monuments to lost lives, the homes darkened with the absence of their inhabitants, the streets overrun by the creeping fingers of nature that would soon begin to reclaim what had been so carefully constructed. The silence that followed was deafening, not a silence born of stillness but of something profound, something deep in the fabric of existence itself, an overwhelming absence, a void that stretched beyond the world itself and into the very meaning of what it had all been for. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the earth continued its rotation, oblivious to the tragedy that had struck its inhabitants. The oceans rolled against the shores, the wind blew through the trees, and the stars continued to shine. In the heavens, untouched by the fate that had befallen mankind, it was as though the world itself had been waiting for this moment, as though it had always known that one day the pulse of humanity would cease, and life would be left to carry on without it. Yet despite the passage of time, something remained, an unsettling presence like a shadow that clung to the edges of reality, a whisper in the wind, a murmur in the silence, asking why and what for. The world had been stripped of its essence, but the questions remained, unanswered and unresolved, floating out into the ether, as if to remind any who might still be listening that life had once been here, that it had once mattered. As time drifted by, the absence of life became more than just an unsettling thought. It became a presence in its own right,